Welcome to the So Damn Insane Show with Jerry Haliva. Today he sits down with his good friend, Sheriff John McGinness.
Welcome to podcast number 4 of the So Damn Insane Show. I am incredibly privileged and honored to have as my guest in this episode a dear and longtime friend, Sheriff John McGinness, who rarely has bad judgment, but appearing here today with me is one of them. John, thank you so much for doing this. I have to tell you, before we get into our conversation, why I'm doing this. And I want my listeners and viewers to understand that the origin of this was I've just had this amazing life, and I wanted to record some of these stories for posterity.
Sure.
But I also wanted to see if in the process I can make a difference, because there's so many people I've been blessed to have as friends in my life. You are right at the top of that list, my friend. But
Honored.
they're people who not only have had interesting lives, but they've used those lives to inspire others. And that's whether it's Willie Brown or your colleague Kitty O'Neill or yourself. There's an inspirational part to your character. And I hope I can inspire in a smaller degree to the way you've inspired people over your career.
Well, I think you've identified a very good subject for this conversation. I think it's pressing, it's compelling for the public to understand and perhaps use this not just for entertainment value, which I know is legitimate. I don't mean to demean that or diminish it, but also for informational value, to actually enlighten people as to some nuance in terms of an area of law and governance in the state of California that is a passion of mine, and I think affects everybody in the state of California.
So, John, that leads me to ask what it was that drew you to a career in law enforcement, a stellar career, if I can say so, but what was the original draw?
Well, so again, as a young child, I was enamored with aviation. Thought I'd like to be a commercial airline pilot. Also was drawn to veterinary medicine. I thought that would be an interesting way to go. But then I had a couple of encounters with law enforcement. I thought this is something new, and it really captured my interest and enthusiasm. Ironically, it was my own father stopped for traffic violations. And the manner in which these 2 deputy sheriffs in Sacramento County treated him and confronted that stop, I was really truly impressed. And I thought that called me, and I just couldn't shake it. I think probably my parents and others thought this is a passing fad. I was about 12 years old, and no, I just continued to get more and more interested in it. And it is worthy of thought, because had it been different officers, a different set of circumstances, maybe not quite so squared away and polished and appropriate in their demeanor, I wouldn't have had that reaction. But they were extraordinary, and really truly sent a message to me that drafted me into the business. And it was very rewarding for me. I loved it, and never, ever looked back, never regretted it. So, and I say it's a very, very important part of everybody's life. If you think about it, for us to enjoy the ability to do what we're doing today, for people to gather, for people to be out and about living their lives, for commerce to thrive, you don't necessarily cognitively consider it, but you have to have an element of safety and protection. And as long as that is in place, it's one less thing to worry about, or one less thing to interfere or obstruct a person's pursuit of their dreams. So it's really, truly affects everybody in society.
John, I think that's an incredibly important point, because not only do you want to have those encounters where people treat each other with some respect and with decency, for lack of a better word, and yet, in today's society, not only is there a question mark as to how often that's occurring, but more importantly, we're not encountering people the way we used to. We're online, we're texting. So the actual connection between human beings has changed a lot over time, and I'm sure it's affected your life in law enforcement. You've seen that change.
Without a doubt. And there is, I think, an inherent element in many of us to not appreciate enforcement efforts, and that enforcement effort may come from a parent to a child, may come from a teacher to a student, could come from some other authority figure in society, an employer, and also clearly, most, I think, a greatest example, the clear illustration of it is law enforcement. So yeah, people may be inclined to resist and resent that contact when it's of an enforcement nature. But think about the consequences of not having rules enforced. In fact, if you want to see a child coming into adulthood and getting into society to try theoretically to be a productive and happy, well-adjusted member of society, the greatest disservice you can do outside of the basics of shelter and nutrition is to not provide that critical element of discipline to cause them to understand there's certain things that will create a bad outcome for you, and you're much better off to know that early on and have that ingrained in the manner in which you analyze and make decisions and live your life going forward. It's an absolutely essential part of that, and we have, I think, transitioned to a great extent in recent years into an attitude and philosophy that should be shunned and resisted, when in reality, I think it should be embraced.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that need for structure is so important in society, in civilization. And going back to what I was saying about the interaction between people, the first part of the word civilization is civil. And the fact that we don't seem to encounter strangers with civility, I'm curious, did you ever reenact with those two officers who stopped your dad to share with them that they were an inspiration for you?
No, unfortunately, I never got to know them. I was, like I say, about 12 years old at the time. So, but they did leave an impression on me. They also, one of them used a line. They did not give my father a citation, by the way, but one of them, he was going too fast. And one of them said, "Hey, you're carrying precious cargo," ironically referring to me. Most people would not agree with that observation, by the way. But I used that line many times myself thereafter. And I also recognize the fact that if you're dealing with a parent who's generally, seems to be a compliant, law-abiding person, but they've engaged in some evidence of a breach of that good judgment, and they made a mistake, they did something they shouldn't have done, don't scold them in the presence of their children. Rather, take them aside, chat with them, and let them enjoy the dignity in the presence of their children.
Right. Well, little did we know that the time would come where precious cargo meant that you were actually driving one of the Sacramento Kings basketball players. But let me ask you more about your career, because again, I grew up, I moved to Sacramento in 1965, and I grew up with giants like Glenn Craig and the Sacramento Police Department, Jack Kearns. I was around, I was enamored of law enforcement. I was always in admiration of what they do. But tell us more about your career, because something that always stood out for me was an incident that people who've been around long enough remember, called the Good Guys.
Yeah. April 4th, 1991, still the biggest hostage incident in the history of the U.S.
The history of the country.
History of the country, in terms of number of hostages taken. There's one that rivals it out of Berkeley. I believe it's Harry's Bar and Grill, and it was a large number as well, but not as big as the Good Guys. And yeah, it was an extraordinary event. It was, regrettably, there's a whole lot of evidence of misguided youth. There's 4 young men, teenagers, ironically very, very small in stature, young immigrants from Vietnam, and they wanted to go back to Vietnam. And as evidence of their lack of awareness and basic common sense, their idea was to take this electronic store hostage, all the patrons therein, the staff, everybody, and they were demanding a helicopter to fly them back to Vietnam, which obviously could never happen. But there's so much inconsistencies in terms of how they did what they did. I was very surprised. I was actually in court, in a courthouse that no longer exists, the old Fair Oaks Justice Court. and I got a call saying, "Hey, your matter is going to be delayed on another calendar because you're needed in South Sacramento." So away I went.
And what was your role at department?
I was in
then?
this, it was called Special Operations unit at the time, not to be confused with SWAT, but Special Operations, kind of a manpower resource to take on different challenges that came up, riding a motorcycle at the time. And I left for South Sacramento, 65th and Florin, at about 1:30 in the afternoon, and was there until after 2 o'clock the next morning. And during the course of this encounter, obviously 40 plus people were held hostage. Regrettably, lives were lost. 3 of the hostage takers were killed by our folks, and it was an incredibly long and daunting day. And it was the first time in my career that everything was playing out live, because you had satellite trucks, media trucks from all over. It looked like the Super Bowl, that parking lot. And you mentioned Glenn Craig. He was the sheriff at the time, and he was relatively new to that role. And it was the first time I'd ever seen the sheriff himself, and I'd worked for other sheriffs, and we had good sheriffs. But to see that level of authority in the organization show up at a scene, it just didn't happen. That's how big this was. And the incident commander, a guy who was an extraordinary leader and a good man, had a tremendous intellect and depth of knowledge, was on the scene. And when he saw the sheriff show up, he says, "Are you taking over?" And the sheriff, I overheard this myself, said, "No, I'm here to take the heat when this goes wrong, because there's no way it's going to not go wrong to some degree." And that was Sheriff Craig, who you knew well, and extraordinary gentleman. Ironically, the incident commander was Captain Mike Smith, who at the time, captain, he wound up promoting from there. Also another extraordinary man. Unfortunately, they're both gone. We've lost both of them. But that was a day that a lot of people earned. I think they're standing, and those 2 leaders certainly among them. And it's interesting to see people that you work with day in and day out, who are, they have strengths and weaknesses. But on that occasion, when their mettle was tested, they stepped in and gave it their all. There were people, 40 plus people, being held hostage. They didn't know one of those people, didn't have a relationship with any of them. They all had families. They all had their lives to live and interests to pursue, and they put themselves directly in harm's way on that occasion for I think the optimum outcome. Not good, but it was as good as it could have been. Ironically, Sacramento County is also home to the longest hostage standoff in terms of duration, and that was in June of 2010 on Arden Way, where again it was resolved when the hostage taker was killed by SWAT, and just some incredible people that did great work. So those are the people I had the pleasure of working with over the years. Those are people that I will value and cherish and respect to an extent that I don't think most people could begin to fathom. And in fact, I got a text message from one of my classmates yesterday after a radio talk show I did, talking about a horrific law that's been passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, called the Elderly Release Program. And so again, this is one of my academy classmates from 40 plus years ago, who texted me to thank me for talking about it. So the bond will always be there.
Well, and I think with going back to the notion of how you are an inspirational person, is that you took your long and exemplary career in law enforcement. You are elected sheriff for eight years, as I recall, but you worked your way up to that position. And then you went on to say, what more can I do to educate people about things that matter, specifically law enforcement? And so you, after filling in for Tom Sullivan at KFBK a number of times, actually launched your own radio show, which I believe dominates the radio market in your time slot, because people find it so valuable. And again, you educate, you inspire, and we're going to get into that elder release program a little bit later in the program. But I do want you to share with the public the story, and we can edit, but the story that you told me of responding for perimeter control to South Sacramento with your partner and share that with us.
Well, it looks like a great moment. Looks as though I really did something extraordinary. And what I frankly did was a routine day at work where I was enjoying myself, which I typically did. I was assigned to a motorcycle. I was in Rancho Cordova with a partner, Steve Bray, good man. And there's a significant event had developed in South Sacramento at the old Campbell's Soup outfit. There was actually a murder committed on that property. So it's a kind of a big scene, and they're calling for additional units to respond, set a perimeter, try to find the suspect and take him into custody. There's very little, scant information about who the person responsible was, but we agreed, we volunteered to head to South Sacramento, which we did, and got down there in a timely fashion. And as we arrived, people are just taking perimeter positions. In other words, shut off this area so the suspect cannot get out, or at least not easily get out, and protect the public too, because you have a killer that's a bona fide documented killer. We have a dead victim, gunshot injury at the scene. So as I positioned my motorcycle and I stopped traffic, and I'm not involved in the investigation in any way, shape, manner, or form. Simply trying to contain the scene, and a man approaches me, and he's carrying a lunchbox, and he didn't look particularly threatening. I didn't think much of him. He's trying to get my attention. I was frankly a little bit annoyed by him, and finally I said, "Okay, what do you got?" And he says, "I just shot a man." I said, "Oh." So at that point, I had him at gunpoint. I said, "Where's the gun?" He says, "It's in my lunchbox." I said, "Drop the lunchbox." And within minutes of my arrival, of course, you announce your arrival on the radio, and you know what your perimeter position is. Very shortly thereafter, I've got the suspect in custody. So to the outside observer, it would look as though, because of me, thank God, I got there and was able to solve this murder. Nothing could be further from the truth, but happenstance, circumstance, and notwithstanding the fact that we're talking about a case in which a life was taken and lost, never to come back, years later, it's still kind of entertaining. Right. And I would be lying if I said I didn't play it up a bit.
Well, what you played down was you said you responded in a timely fashion. You loved getting on that bike and going as fast as the situation required.
When the need arose, it was certainly something that we were willing to do, oftentimes with a smile.
Very good. Well, I want to move to something that's kind of parallel, because what your career has always said to me and so many others is that you wanted to learn from experiences to build on your ability to do your job better and to serve the public better. When I first started the legislature, I was probably the opposite of those values. I was enamored of the power of being a staffer at the legislature. And circumstances arose where the man I worked for, who was formerly the majority leader, but had to move because somebody else moved into that job, had an opportunity for a committee and turned to me and asked me what ideas I might have for a select committee. Well, I had worked previously for the first African-American state senator in California history, Mervyn Dimely, and when I was working in his office as a Ford Foundation fellow, I went through the mail that he received from constituents, and I got one that was not from a constituent, because he was South Central LA. The return address was Repressa, which I think is down the street from here, and it was Folsom Prison. And this inmate had said that he was paralyzed and was not receiving any health care for his paralysis and needed help. I was, like Senator Dimely, very left of center politically at the time. And I thought, oh my God, this is clearly prison abuse. I want to find out, I want to get to the bottom of it. So under color of authority, a phrase you're familiar with, I actually went out there and I interviewed the inmate. I interviewed the guards. The guards informed me that he was absolutely making this up, that they've seen him standing, walking. But when I was talking to him, I noticed that his legs were completely atrophied. There was no way he was going to be able to stand on those legs, from my uninformed opinion. End of the day, it turns out that the doctor who was treating him was a zealot in terms of his Christian faith. And he said to the inmate, he said, "You'll walk again if you pray with me." And the inmate said, "That's going to be a problem because I'm Jewish." And the doctor said, "Well, then you're a heathen and you should crawl." That got my blood boiling, being Jewish myself, and somewhat convinced that all of these 12 institutions in California were probably torture centers. I immediately got things moving and resolved the situation to the degree that the inmate started to receive medical care, and the doctor ended up not being fired, but being transferred to a different facility. So this is 1970. In 1972, when this committee opportunity came up, I said to Mr. Karabian, I said, "How about prison reform?" He said, "Fine." And we created a select committee on prison reform and rehabilitation. My ego, which was substantial, because again, I was into power, and my belief, my predetermined philosophy, is that most people are in prison because of the color of their skin or their economic despair. So I went in with that attitude, which is not a good approach for a researcher and doesn't comport, in your favorite word, doesn't comport with the notion of maybe facts matter. And as I did that process, it was very educational for me. Number one, educating me on my own bias. And number two, educating me on the fact that there were problems. And we issued a couple of reports, one specifically on medical care. And there were serious problems in the 70s at prison with medical care. One big example is that prisons worked out programs with pharmaceutical companies to allow inmates to basically be guinea pigs for medications. Another was that a lot of the hospital medical staff weren't necessarily qualified to be in private practice, so they took these state jobs. But more importantly, there was need for repair. There was need for improvement. And the director at the time, Raymond Pecunier, was very supportive of our efforts. We did, my colleague Blair Springer, who we just lost not too long ago, Blair and I did issue these demands that were outrageous, John. I mean, we said we want 24/7 access to all of our prisons in California. If we call, we want to be let in. It was absurd. I'm embarrassed to actually tell that story. But the director said, "Fine, as long as you sign the waiver, something bad happens, not on us." But it resulted in opportunities. The second report had to do with the use of what they called adjustment centers. That, if there ever was a definition of a euphemism, calling isolation an adjustment center was definitely a euphemism. But it resulted in my actually doing some incredible interviews. I interviewed Charlie Manson when he was right down the street here at Folsom Prison. And it was chilling. I really felt like I encountered evil for the first time in my life. And I will give you the quote from that interview, which is, he said, "I never offed anybody, but if I did, it would be because my fellow man is hassling me, and that makes it incumbent on me to end that." And I go, sounds like a little something from the Twilight Zone, but this was Charlie Manson. I subsequently interviewed the Manson girls at the Frontera prison in Chino. That got my blood boiling, John, because they lived in a secure area in the middle of the prison. cottage, a cute little cottage. They had gardens, they had TV sets, and I had had now sufficient experience and education of the prison system that this just drove me nuts. And I lost all my professionalism because when Leslie Van Houten actually said, I asked her what she did all day, and she says, "Oh, we're just waiting for Charlie to come get us." And unprofessional as possible, I said, "You know what? I just left Charlie, and he's not going anywhere, and neither are you." But that kind of was the transition. I also had the chance to interview, the opportunity to interview Firhan. And again, my Jewish heritage came up because when, I don't remember how it came up, but I said I happened to be Jewish, he actually spit at me through the bars. Yeah. So, needless to say, I came away with, actually, I think we accomplished some things in terms of, like, for instance, isolation being used more for punishment than for what it was intended, which was to control the safety of the general population and officers. But I came away at the end believing that the prison system in the 70s really required diversion. How do we keep people out of the institutions by having sufficient programs, especially for younger people, that might prevent them from actually offending to the level that put them in, that made them incarcerated. Because incarceration, again, I thought, did not have much rehabilitation in the 70s, and you were much more likely to be a recidivist back in those days.
Well, you said a lot there, and I'm drawing some things out of it as you're saying it. And one of the things you said, you went into this with a preconceived notion that based on your race or economic standing, you're more likely to be incarcerated. And you probably think I would reject that outright, and candidly, I don't. Not so much race, but I think the reality is you see generation after generation of poverty. Inner city poverty, which typically brings with it, I mean, that's where, frankly, you see more ethnic minorities. And you see a lack of continuum of frankly, nurturing kids. In my world and in the world of people around me, when your kids are young, you read to them, and then there's a transition. Something magic happens when you have the kids start reading to you, and you guide them along the way, either through being a positive role model and confronting the world's challenges with discipline and grit and doing the right thing, or more actively involved in trying to help a young person chart their course, find out what's the best direction for them to go, and help them meet those needs and goals. That is lost out in certain parts of our society, and yes, as a result, people fall out. They have a lack of confidence. You have now third and fourth generation people who are products of a gang lifestyle, of a constant environment and chain of reoffending, and only knowing that lifestyle, and they seem to develop along the way, probably not illogically, that either you're born into wealth and privilege or you're going to prey on others. So I think there is an element of that. So I want to change that, and I would love to see that change by looking at the cultures that do very well and identifying what is it. I don't think there's anything in their DNA. I don't think there's anything in the pigment in their skin. In fact, I wholeheartedly believe that it is the manner in which they're raised. And you will find outliers. You'll find kids that come from what appeared to be extraordinarily blessed families, and they just can't get it. They don't do well. And conversely, you'll find kids that come up in the system that I think is so destructive, of just generation after generation of a lack of guidance and commitment and nurture and care, and somehow they shine through that and do well. But the masses seem to be pretty predictable. So part of it goes back to the notion that punishment or discipline, and remember the term discipline actually means to educate. And punishment can be a part of that. There is a punitive part of it, right? If you touch the hot object, you burn, and that's a part of a defense system mechanism that we have, that Mother Nature has given us, so you don't do damage to yourself. The nerves feel the pain and you change your behavior. We need to have that in terms of guidance and information and education for people as young children growing, as people in a society as adults, that need to understand certain kinds of behavior are not acceptable and they will bring about an adverse consequence. So you help extol the reality of that along the way and increase the likelihood that they're going to behave better. But we've lost a tremendous amount of that. As it relates to the conditions in the prison system in the 1970s, frankly, I can't speak to that. 1970, in spite of my looks, I was in elementary school in 1970. So but I can tell you now, you and I we're pretty blessed people.
Yeah.
We've had good lives.
Extremely.
And if we found ourselves in a position where we needed some kind of a specialist in medicine, we are going to wait longer than somebody who is an inmate in a California correctional institute. So medical care is extraordinarily positive. It's a tremendous benefit, frankly, for the inmate. And so I don't want to deviate from that. We can't, right? And the burden that the taxpayers, the system take when you incarcerate somebody, you have responsibility for feeding, sheltering, and providing medical care. So that, lawsuits have influenced that. Litigation concerns, liability has influenced all of that. And I would common decency and I think a good moral compass, which not everybody has, but if that's to be appreciated, you never would engage in aberrant treatment of somebody in custody. Similarly, we have the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution that prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Nobody should advocate for that or a change to that. It's how things should be. But prison is not intended to be a pleasant experience. Again, not cruel and unusual ever. But I think there has to be an acceptance of a couple of undeniable realities. Another thing you said that sticks with me is you met evil. Well, there is evil that exists. I hate to say it, Charles Manson was evil. The people that were duped into following him, I don't know if they really rose to evil unto their own volition, but they wound up behaving in an evil fashion. There's an extraordinary case, goes back probably about a half a dozen years ago now. I may be off on that by a bit. It's out of the city of Davis, and I'm not going to say the defendant, the inmate, now the convicted inmate's name, because I don't like to glorify people who do horrible things. He was a teenager at the time, a juvenile, 17 years of age. And he just wanted to know what it would be like to kill people. So we found octogenarians sleeping in their beds, forced his way into their home and killed, actually the male half of that was in his 80s, was an octogenarian. I believe his wife was in her 70s still. Killed both of them just because he wanted to see what it would be like. And when the police arrested him shortly after the commission of that double murder, guess what? He had determined he liked it and he was going to reoffend. So, and he actually acknowledged that. That was where he was headed. He was going to go kill again. Ironically, that has another nuance to it, a change in law that makes it much more difficult now to prosecute somebody in that age range as an adult. And there's great limitations under California law now. And in many cases, it's impossible to keep them past the age of 24. Regardless of the evil that they display and the irreversible damage they've done to other human beings. So there is evil. Do I believe in redemption? Yes, I do. This is something Governor Brown and I argued about. I do believe in redemption. But you've got to see evidence in play that there is an effort and a willingness on the part of the individual to be redeemed. If you simply warehouse somebody who has displayed an element of evil, or to a lesser degree, just really bad conduct, you warehouse them for a period of time and just turn them loose because you believe in redemption. That's not redemption. And I'm afraid that's where we find ourselves in California today.
And I think, John, what really ties this together is my belief as I went into the prisons in the 70s and the reality that I was confronted with that have educated me, I think, combined with values that you and I share and the benefit of being raised with those values. But I also think that those values have changed. And you've heard me say this before. I blame the boomers, myself, for doing so much from our heart as opposed to when we used to also use our heads. And if we use our heads, we realize that there's a role for prisons. We need prisons as part of public safety. And that role is not only to separate them from society, but it also to some degree is to have consequences for their actions, which can be described as punishment. But it's not cruel and unusual punishment, but there is a punishment side to penal institutions. And I think what has changed, and I want to hear more about this, I think, absurd law in California that we have an elder release program that I think was the subject of your conversation with Jeff Reisig, the Yolo County District Attorney, on your show yesterday.
It was. And if I may just go back to one other observation. In terms of rehabilitation, because I don't want to dismiss it. I think there's value there. But if you look at what puts people in that lifestyle where they're going, their father and grandfather spent most of their time in custody. They're institutionalized. What have they seen? What have they observed? What have they been influenced to do along the way? Well, they inherit the family traditions. So if you can break that during their time in custody, maybe teach them a skill, maybe just explain to them, cause them to experience. You're not going to save them all. I'm not foolish. I understand that. But put them in a position where they understand the need to present themselves for acceptable behavior to an employer, potentially, to, at some point, a customer or a client, if they're going to actually change their way. Do that. Get them in a position where they have some volition while in custody to actually go to a job, to present themselves to somebody who's supervising them, probably correctional staff, and begin to hone skills that they can use on the outside. So they would have the benefit when they get out of custody for the first time in their lives, living a lawful life, a law-abiding, compliant life in which they don't have an ongoing, relentless expectation that their door is going to get kicked off the hinges and they're going to be taken back into custody, because they don't have to fear that, right? Why don't we give them the liberty of living a good life? And I think there are people who would assert that if you believe in consequences for criminal offenses, you don't care about those people. Nothing could be further from the truth. As it relates to the elderly release program.
Well, before you get to elderly release, I think you mentioned Governor Brown, who I actually enjoy the good working relationship with, but he was the author of the concept of realignment. Yeah. How do we get people out of prisons without, I don't think, a lot of factual justification in the process of how that was carried out. And so that concept, I think, started under Governor Brown.
It did.
And it has continued, even though there's a reasonable challenge to its wisdom. And now we have something even more absurd than the emptying of prisons with realignment. We now have this elder release program.
Actually, elderly release program. And you might think, upon hearing this, okay, so you get somebody who's 95 years old on a ventilator, they did some bad things in their day. Yeah, why do we want them in custody? Why do we want that burden? Well, the number is important. And what the legislature gave the governor, by the way, a completely 100% partisan decision on the part of the legislature, they gave him the age of 60. So 60 was elderly. The governor said, no, 50. Well, the governor himself will be 59 in October. Does he look like somebody who wouldn't be capable of carrying out misdeeds if he was so inclined? I'm not suggesting he's inclined to commit criminal violence, but certainly would be capable of it. He's tall, slender, looks to be physically fit. I got about 8 years on him, and I work out at the gym 3 days a week. I run. I feel comfortable and healthy as ever. And if I was predisposed to do bad things to people, I still have the ability to do it. That's part of it. So the foolishness of that unto itself.
I do have to interrupt and say that if somebody called me elderly, I'll be 80 in May. If somebody called me elderly, it would have to be because I can't hear and because I can't remember. Both of those would make justification for somebody to call me elderly. Otherwise, don't call me elderly.
Yeah. Well, valid. I think that's fair. And to make it 50, even more so. And again, look at Governor Newsom himself. Does he look like an elderly man to you?
No.
So I think that's complete and total indefensible logic, frankly. And then there's another element to it. When you have somebody, even if this person is at a point where they don't have the capacity to carry out their misguided evil deeds for whatever reason, I think we should accept the fact that for certain kinds of conduct, they have earned their place in punishment, and they should not be forgiven for that. They should finish out their life in custody. Classic example, you talk about Jeff Reisig, the district attorney in Yolo County. He explained this case very well. This person who is now 63 years of age, and I don't want to get too specific on the details because I might misstate it. Suffice to say, he, on an ongoing basis, raped an 11-year-old girl. I think it was 21 times for which he was actually convicted by a jury. And then upon learning that he had impregnated her, again, 11, she may have been 12 by the time this happened, he attempted to cause in a violent way the abortion of that fetus because she was pregnant. Not through a surgical procedure, but rather violent attacks on her, throwing her out of a truck and other behavior that obviously completely and totally indefensible. So the post-rape behavior was as egregious as the ongoing recurrent rapes themselves. This guy now has been before the first opportunity to get early release at I believe he's 63, maybe 62 still, appears to be a healthy person.
What was his sentence?
130 plus years. So that was obviously the parole board thinks that's okay, and the governor signed this into law. He actually reduced the threshold from 60 to 50. So I have a very difficult time understanding that. Now, ultimately, the governor will very likely have a chance to make the determination as to whether or not this guy gets released. I suspect, and you can feel free to accuse me of being jaded in this regard, but I suspect the fact that Governor Newsom is going to be, in fact, is now a candidate for president in 2028, might possibly influence him and inure to the benefit of the public, because he might be more inclined to keep this person in custody where he belongs. And by the way, worthy of note, this person is illegally in the country.
Well, I want to come back to the concept that we've moved into a society where we're spending much more time feeling bad about things without thinking about real solutions. One of the reasons I admire your career, John, is that you look at facts and the situation, but you look at them in a compassionate and caring way. But as a result of being able to both think and feel, I think you've become an exemplary role model for lots of us, myself included. And I'm hoping that as people start to think more about solutions to problems, whether it's at the initiative level, whether it's at the ballot box originally when they have done their research and determined what the right use of that franchise is, I'm hoping that's the future that lies ahead for us. And I also hope that that our conversation has been worthy of your time, which I value tremendously.
And along those lines, if I may, you talk about thinking or reasoning, I think more accurately, analysis versus emotion. I think there's a place for both, and actually the law allows a place for both. So if you have a set of circumstances where a person is charged with a crime, and the state, the prosecutor, has met the elements of that to satisfy a jury of the defendant's peers as to their guilt, there are opportunities under the law for aggravation and mitigation when it comes to sentencing. So was this a one-off? Has the person post the criminal act been inclined to behave in a better way, tried to offer some level of restoration to the people who have been harmed by his conduct? Or did they get worse? Did they engage in the kind of conduct this person out of Yolo County did after the fact? So you have either mitigation or aggravation that can be considered for sentencing. But in terms of the behavior itself, look at the elements of the law. And I think if you look at a person who is charged with a crime, and you're potentially on a jury, and you look at the counsel table, you see the defendant, they just look like a likable, nice person. They're the president of the local service club. They're active in their church or religious institution. They're a nice person. But the elements are there. They committed the crime. That's what matters. Conversely, they could look like the village villain, and the elements are not there. They walk. That's the obligation that we have. And we should apply that same analytical thought process when it comes to selecting our representatives in our system of government.
Well said, John. You are a great articulator of your values and the values that I think would serve all of us very well.
Well, thank
and
you,
once
sir.
again, I'm grateful to have you as a friend and to have you as a guest.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Jerry.